The Galactic Council's warning. The first time Ambassador Cal of the Selfar Dominion heard about Earth, he thought it was a joke, a planet classified as a death world, a primitive species that somehow survived in an environment deemed suicidal by most civilized species. It had to be an exaggeration, one of those galactic myths spread by overenthusiastic explorers. But then the council meeting changed everything. Cal sat among the most powerful beings in the galaxy, their presence filling the great chamber with an oppressive weight. The unified Galactic Council rarely summoned emergency meetings, and when they did, it usually meant an existential crisis was unfolding. His three hearts pounded as Supreme Arbiter Xyr, an ancient and revered leader of the Othuri, stood at the podium, her bioluminescent skin pulsing with concern. The time has come for us to address a growing threat to our galactic order, Xyr announced, her voice amplified by the chamber's resonators. The species known as humans have displayed an alarming ability to defy logic, natural selection, and even their own mortality. They inhabit a death world known as Earth, a planet where nearly everything is designed to kill. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Cal narrowed his eyes. He had read snippets about humans before, but he never took them seriously. His people had conquered 7 systems, bending entire civilizations to their will. What could one insignificant species possibly do? They are unpredictable, Xyr continued. Unlike other species, they do not merely adapt to danger. They seek it out. They have turned survival into an obsession. They run toward conflict rather than away from it. And now, they have developed spacefaring capabilities. That made Cal sit up straighter. Spacefaring. That meant humans could potentially enter galactic politics, and worse, they could pose a military threat. Xyr gestured toward the holographic display in the center of the chamber. A rotating image of Earth appeared, a blue and green world, seemingly peaceful at first glance. But then the data feeds began scrolling. Supervolcanoes, hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, extreme temperatures, venomous wildlife, apex predators, disease outbreaks, wars. Cal scoffed. A planet this unstable should have wiped out its dominant species long ago. That is the issue, Xyr responded sharply, her glowing eyes locking onto him. It didn't. The chamber fell into stunned silence. The humans not only survived this apocalyptic world, they thrived in it, she continued. They tamed beasts, reshaped landscapes, and built civilizations atop nature's courts. Their history is filled with wars, wars against their own kind, wars against their own environment, wars against the very limits of their fragile biology. A hologram shifted to show a series of images, humans climbing icy mountains without protective gear, swimming in waters infested with predators, skydiving from the edge of their atmosphere. Then came images of their wars, machines of destruction rolling across battlefields, cities reduced to rubble, soldiers advancing despite injuries that should have been fatal. Cal frowned. Are they suicidal? No, Xyr answered. They are simply the most stubborn creatures we have ever encountered. A ripple of unease spread through the council. Stubbornness was dangerous. The galaxy had seen empires crumble because of it. Cal still wasn't convinced. What of their technology? Surely, if they are as reckless as you claim, they cannot be that advanced. Xyr sighed. That is the most perplexing part. Their technology is chaotic, illogical. They do not progress in a linear fashion like most species. They jump between advancements with no clear pattern. They send machines to other worlds before they cure basic diseases. They build weapons capable of planetary devastation, while still using wheeled vehicles for transport. Their methods make no sense. The hologram displayed human spacecraft, patched together, often relying on brute force rather than elegance. Yet, somehow, they worked. Cal's mandibles clicked in agitation. And you believe they are a threat? Xyr's glow dimmed. The issue is that we don't know. Humans are the first species we have encountered that do not adhere to a predictable pattern. Their ability to survive and innovate under pressure is unnerving. A tense silence filled the chamber. The implications were clear. A species that defied logic, survived the impossible, and pursued danger for pleasure was a wild card. Kale exhaled slowly. So what do we do? For now, as you were said, we observe, we study them. But make no mistake, if humans ever unite under a single purpose, if they ever set their sights beyond their own conflicts, they may become the most dangerous force the galaxy has ever seen. The meeting adjourned, but Kale felt a deep unease settle within him. He had conquered entire civilizations without hesitation, but something about these humans, something about Earth itself felt different. As he left the chamber, a single thought lingered in his mind. How do you stop an enemy that refuses to accept the very concept of defeat? And worse, what if they don't see themselves as enemies at all? Kale shuddered. The galaxy had just changed forever. Earth had entered the stage, and there was no turning back. The unwelcome first contact. Kale sat in his private chambers aboard that Selphar diplomatic cruiser, staring at the glowing data feed before him. The more he read, the more unsettled he became. Humans were chaotic, unpredictable, and absurdly resilient. Every report he studied confirmed it. It wasn't just their planet that defied logic. They themselves were an anomaly. He had read about their species-wide immunity to despair, civilizations that should have collapsed rebuilt, leaders who were defeated returned stronger, wars that wiped out millions were followed by newer, more ambitious innovations. No other species operated like this. But none of it prepared him for the moment his ship received a direct transmission from Earth itself. A direct challenge. The screen flickered to life. Kale expected a council-appointed diplomat or a military leader. Instead, he was greeted by a human in a worn-out flight suit, with a cocky smirk and tired eyes. "Yo," the human said casually, leaning back in his chair. "I hear you've been watching us." Kale stiffened. This was highly irregular. First contact procedures were meant to be strict, formal affairs, conducted with precision and care. Yet this human behaved as if he was speaking to an old acquaintance over a drink. Kale composed himself. "This is Ambassador Kale of the Selphar Dominion. Identify yourself." The human grinned. "Call me Captain Elias Kane. Earth Defense Force." Earth had a defense force. Kale's mandibles clicked in irritation. That detail had not been in the reports. Kane leaned forward. "So, you guys have been sitting in orbit, spying on us. What do you want?" Kale hesitated. Humans weren't supposed to be this direct. In most diplomatic encounters, weaker species responded with awe or fear when confronted by an advanced civilization. But Kane looked unimpressed. Kale cleared his throat. "We are here on an observation mission, per the orders of the unified Galactic Council. Your species has been classified as a potentially dangerous anomaly, and we wish to understand you better." Kane snorted. "Potentially dangerous, huh? That's a fancy way of saying, we don't get you, and that makes us nervous." Kale blinked. How did he already understand the galactic perspective? Kane continued, stretching lazily. "All right, I'll make this easy for you, Ambassador. If you want to study us, you do it on our terms. No creeping around. No playing mysterious alien overlord nonsense. You want to see how we live? Come down here. Face to face." Cal's breath hitched. Did this human just invite him to Earth? "Absolutely not," Cal replied immediately. "Your planet is classified as a death world. The environmental instability, the biological hazards, and the general unpredictability." Kane laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not a diplomatic chuckle. A full, genuine, amused laugh. "Oh man," Kane grinned, shaking his head. "I love how you aliens think Earth is some kinda cosmic horror show. But here's the thing. You don't really get it, do you?" Kale narrowed his eyes. "Explain." Kane's smirk faded slightly. His gaze turned serious. You think of Earth as a dangerous place. You see our storms, our wars, our disasters, and you assume it's a miracle we're still standing. He leaned in, voice steady. But what you don't understand is, we are the storm. Cal's hearts pounded. We don't just survive here, Kane continued. We tame this place. We shape it to our will. The disasters, we rebuild. The dangers, we overcome. The threats, we turn them into challenges. Cale stared, speechless. And if you really want to understand us, Kane added, you can't do it from orbit. You gotta see it up close. Cale hesitated. Every instinct told him this was reckless. But an opportunity like this, it was unheard of. First contact with a death world species on their own soil. Finally, Cale took a deep breath. I accept. Kane's grin returned. Good. Buckle up, Ambassador. You're in for a hell of a ride. Atmospheric entry. The descent into Earth's atmosphere was a nightmare. Cale's shuttle shook violently, buffeted by turbulent air currents that would have torn lesser ships apart. He clutched the armrest, his 6 eyes squeezed shut. He had landed on hundreds of planets, but this was madness. Through the viewport, he saw lightning storms flickering over vast oceans, winds screaming across endless landscapes. The sheer scale of Earth's fury was incomprehensible. And yet, humans thrived in this. The shuttle finally touched down on a large landing pad, steam hissing as stabilizers engage. Cale took a shaky breath. He was alive. For now. As the doors hissed open, a wave of humid, oxygen-rich air rushed in. It was thicker, heavier than what he was used to. The gravity was slightly higher, pressing against his exoskeleton. And then he saw them. Humans, standing in neat rows, wearing practical uniforms. Their expressions were unreadable, neither hostile nor overly welcoming. Just watching. At the front stood Kane, hands on his hips, smirking. Welcome to Earth, Ambassador. Cal's instincts screamed at him to turn back, to flee to the safety of the stars. But he forced himself to step forward. The crowd murmured. Whispers spread. He was the first alien diplomat to set foot on Earth. Kane chuckled. You nervous? Cale straightened his posture. Of course not. Good, Kane said, because your tour starts now. Next stop, the city. The journey into human civilization was unlike anything Cale had ever experienced. His transport skimmed over massive steel jungles, towers of glass stretching toward the sky, streets buzzing with metal beasts moving at insane speeds. Everywhere, humans moved with purpose, seemingly unbothered by the sheer chaos surrounding them. Cale's translator struggled to keep up with the conversations around him. Laughter, arguments, deals being struck, stories being told. It was a city, but it felt like a battlefield. First impressions, Kane asked from the pilot's seat. Cale exhaled slowly. It is overwhelming. Kane grinned. You haven't seen anything yet. Cale watched as a group of human children played soccer in the streets, dodging vehicles without a second thought. He observed workers climbing skyscrapers without safety nets, builders welding metal beams above dizzying heights. These creatures were insane. And yet, they moved like they belonged here. For the first time, a chill crept down Cal's spine. What kind of species thrived in a world designed to kill them? He didn't have an answer. But he was about to find out. The chaos that breathes. Cal's 6 eyes darted across the sprawling chaos of the human cityscape, struggling to make sense of what he was witnessing. From the air, the city had been a dazzling labyrinth of steel, glass, and neon light. But now, standing within its bustling streets, he felt as if he had stepped into the heart of a living, breathing organism, one that thrived on chaos. Buildings stretched towards the heavens, interconnected by an intricate network of walkways and cables. Below, metal beasts, humans called them vehicles, raced forward at breakneck speeds, barely avoiding each other as their operators exchanged what could only be ritualistic gestures of aggression. And yet, in all this madness, humans moved with effortless precision. They wove through crowds without hesitation, their steps confident, their voices rising and falling in a symphony of transactions, laughter, and heated debates. It was not the mindless disorder Kale had expected. No, this was something else. It was controlled chaos. And the humans, they thrived in it. An unshaken people. First time in a human city, Captain Elias Kane asked, his usual smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Kale had lost count of how many times his mandibles had clicked in agitation since arriving. His instincts, honed through years of diplomacy and war, screamed at him to flee. This was not normal. This was madness. And yet, he couldn't look away. I have been to over 75 planetary civilizations, Kale admitted, forcing himself to remain composed. None of them have prepared me for this. Kane chuckled. That's because none of them are Earth. Kale's gaze drifted across the streets. There were humans dangling off the sides of towering structures, repairing cables with nothing but a flimsy harness. Others were rushing through on bicycles, narrowly dodging pedestrians without even slowing down. Nearby, an elderly human sat casually on a bench, reading from a fragile paper device, completely unbothered as a deafening explosion erupted in the distance. Kale tensed. Should we take cover? Kane barely blinked. Ha! Oh, that's just some construction, or maybe a car backfiring. He shrugged. Either way, no big deal. No big deal. Kale watched as a group of children, actual hatchlings, ran toward the disturbance rather than away from it. They giggled as they peered through a metal fence at the smoke rising from an alleyway. This was sheer insanity. Why? Kale found himself asking aloud. Kane raised an eyebrow. Why what? Kale struggled to find the words. Why were humans so unshaken? Why did they run toward danger instead of away from it? Why did they act as if the very laws of survival didn't apply to them? Instead, he simply asked, why are they not afraid? Kane's expression changed. His smirk faded, not into seriousness, but into something deeper. Because we've been through worse, he said simply. Kale turned toward him. Worse. Kane motioned for him to follow. Come on. You need to see something. Memories carved in stone. The shuttle ride was short, but it took them away from the ceaseless energy of the city and into an open, quiet expanse. Kale stepped out, his gaze immediately landing on a sprawling memorial carved into the stone. Names, thousands, millions of names. It was not a battlefield, yet it held the weight of one. It was a place of remembrance. Kale moved cautiously, his claws clicking against the pavement. He traced his fingers over the carved letters, recognizing the human writing system, but not the individual meanings. Kane exhaled slowly. These are the names of those we lost. Kale's antenna twitched. From what? Kane glanced at the memorial, his expression unreadable. From everything. He gestured toward different sections. Wars, natural disasters, pandemics, acts of terror. Kale's breath caught as he realized this was not one war. This was not one disaster. This was a collection of all the times humanity had faced annihilation and survived. Kane crossed his arms. We have a saying, you know. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Kale turned to him. Is that why your people thrive in chaos? Because you were born in it? Kane nodded. Something like that. He knelt, placing a hand on one of the names. His voice was softer now. We don't just endure, Kale. We rebuild. We adapt. We overcome. No matter how many times we get knocked down, we get back up. Kale stared at the human beside him. For the first time, he understood. It wasn't that humans didn't fear death. It was that they refused to let it define them. And that was what made them dangerous. Kale took a slow, measured breath, Perhaps the Galactic Council was right to fear you. Kane chuckled. Fear us? Nah. They should be inspired. Cale didn't know if that was optimism or a warning. Maybe it was both. The challenge of Earth. As they returned to the city, Cal's mind raced. He had studied species that had mastered war, species that had conquered entire systems without hesitation. But they had done so out of strategy, out of cold logic. Humans were different. They didn't just survive out of necessity. They survived because they refused not to. They turned their tragedies into strength. They wore their scars like armor. And if they ever turned that unbreakable will outward, Cale shuddered at the thought. What now? He asked as their transport landed. Kane smirked. Now you get to see what we do for fun. Cale frowned. Fun. Kane grinned. Let's just say, if you think we're insane for how we handle danger, wait till you see what we do when we're bored. Cale had a very bad feeling about this, and he was probably right. The madness of human entertainment. Cale had barely recovered from his previous revelations about humanity when Kane dragged him into the next level of insanity. Human entertainment. Cale had studied galactic cultures for years. Every species had methods of relaxation and amusement, usually calm and structured. Art, music, theater, or virtual reality simulations. Even the more aggressive warrior species had ritualistic combat games that adhered to strict rules. Humans? They turned recklessness into a pastime. A reckless invitation. Cale had no idea what Kane meant when he said, let's start with something easy. Easy, apparently, meant being thrust into a harness, strapped into a high-speed vehicle, and hurled across a twisting metal track that seemed intentionally designed to defy gravity. They called it a roller coaster. Cale called it a death sentence. Are you certain this is safe? Cale asked, his claws tightening around the metal bar in front of him. His exoskeleton tingled with primal dread. Kane grinned, pulling down his own safety harness with a casual ease that only made Cale more nervous. Safe enough. Nobody's died here in, I dunno, a few years. A few years. Cale's mandibles clicked in horror. Too late. The metal beast roared to life. The machine lurched forward, beginning its climb up an impossibly steep incline. Cale's breathing quickened as they rose higher and higher, the city shrinking below them. At the peak, there was a single, agonizing second of silence. Then, the drop. Cale's stomach attempted to escape through his mandibles as the coaster plummeted at a velocity that should have shattered the laws of physics. His vision blurred. The world became a screaming wind tunnel of impossible twists, gut-wrenching turns, and loops that defied all reason. Next to him, Kane was laughing. Cale barely processed anything beyond the overwhelming realization that humans had built this nightmare voluntarily. They had designed, engineered, and perfected this horror, and then they lined up to experience it. The moment the ride screeched to a halt, Cale practically fell out of his seat. His exoskeleton trembled. His 3 hearts pounded in chaotic rhythms. He could barely stand. Kane slapped him on the back. Not bad for your first ride. Wanna go again? Cale turned to him, his 6 eyes filled with pure betrayal. Absolutely not. Kane shrugged. All right. Let's try something different. Cale doubted that anything could be worse than what he had just endured. He was wrong. Humans and their need to fight. The next stop was something called an arena. Cale was instantly on edge. His people had seen many arenas in the galaxy, most of them used for gladiatorial combat or war simulations. He expected something similar. What he did not expect was to see 2 humans in a massive cage, wearing padded gloves and punching each other repeatedly while a roaring crowd encouraged it. Cale stiffened. This is a death match. Kane laughed. Nah, it's just a sport. They're not trying to kill each other. Cale's mandibles clicked. They are literally beating each other into unconsciousness. Kane waved a hand dismissively. Yeah, but they train for this. It's all about skill. It's controlled violence. Cale did not understand. Why would any species willingly engage in controlled violence? The crowd's energy was palpable. People were shouting, cheering, roaring with excitement as one fighter took a particularly devastating hit. Blood splattered against the mat. Cale tensed. Do they not fear injury? Kane smirked. Fear? Nah. If anything, they love a good underdog story. The guy getting beat up now. If he gets back up and wins, the crowd's gonna lose their minds. Cale did not know how to process this. Humans celebrated pain. They treated it as a test, not a deterrent. They thrived in situations that any other species would deem too dangerous, too reckless, too unpredictable. And worse, they loved it. As the victorious fighter raised his fists, the entire arena shook with applause. Cale had never feared a species more in his life. Earth's ultimate madness. By now, Cale had lost all trust in human judgment. And yet Kane had one more surprise. This, Kane said proudly, is the pinnacle of human entertainment. Cale stared at the arena of dirt, giant wheels, and roaring machines. He stared at the massive metal vehicles crushing smaller ones beneath them, while humans cheered in absolute delight. Explain. Kane grinned. Monster trucks. Cale's antenna twitched. And what is the purpose of these monsters? To do this. Kane pointed. Right on cue, one of the massive four-wheeled behemoths launched itself off a ramp, did a full mid-air spin, and landed with a thunderous crash, flattening an entire row of scrap vehicles beneath it. The crowd went berserk. Cale could not breathe. He had witnessed intergalactic wars, supernova consuming entire planets, black holes devouring systems. None of it compared to the sheer insanity of what he had just seen. Why? Cale managed to croak. Why do you do this? Kane actually looked thoughtful for a moment. Then he shrugged. Because it's fun. Cale stared. Kane smirked. And because, Ambassador, humans don't just survive chaos. We make it our playground. Cale sat down. He needed a moment. Perhaps several. A growing fear. As they left the event, Cale remained deep in thought. At first, he had feared humans because of their resilience, their refusal to yield. Now he feared them for an entirely different reason. They did not just endure hardship. They sought it out for entertainment. They did not just adapt to danger. They celebrated it. Cale had always thought that the greatest threats in the galaxy were those with power, military strength, and strategic intelligence. But humans were something else entirely. They were the species that looked into the abyss and laughed. And Cale had the sinking realization that if humanity ever set its sights beyond Earth, the galaxy would never be the same again.